All right. Good day to everybody out there. So today we're going to talk about some of the things you need to think about, some up front and some during the process that are flexible, but mainly things that you need to consider when you're making decisions for a PDM professional implementation. So again, these are going to be wide-ranging from a few different things. So we'll get into this as we go. Now we're recording this session as we typically do. So we'll post this up on our YouTube channel here shortly, and everybody will have access to this afterwards. So my name is Darren. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I use SolidWorks as much as possible, whether it's for company projects or whether it's for things that I do for my own sake. So I use it all the time around the yard, whether I'm just trying to design something, get an idea of really where I want to go with something. And I also use a 3D printer quite often. So I'm building other types of data, whether it's architectural, whether it's components that I'm going to use as end-use goods. Mainly what I'm using, though, is just my exercise of SolidWorks and trying to get a job done. Now, when I'm doing this, even though I'm a one-man show, I'm not working on a network. I don't work with other people with any of these projects. And all of the data I create in reality is really for my own consumption with all of these types of projects. But the main thing about the main commonality amongst all of these is since 2008, I've been housing all of my own data in my own PDM vault. Now, it's actually sold. It's called EPDM, so we've changed that name since then. But Enterprise or PDM Professional is a tool that's useful not just for what you might think the typical purposes are, which would be, network performance and having control of multiple people with their hand in the data. I use it simply for revision control, for tracking the history of my files, and for making sure I don't accidentally step on my designs by saving in Windows like we typically do and overwriting everything that happened before that. So whether I'm working or whether I'm on my own, PDM is definitely the underpinnings of everything that I do, and it's saved me a handful of times, and I'm really endeared to it as a result of that. So today what we're going to get into again is some of the things that you need to think about and some of the considerations that you want to make up front and on the fly when it comes to a PDM implementation. So today what we're going to get into really is going to be some of the basic things that you think about beyond revision control. And we really want to demystify some of these things because some considerations are far-reaching. They're going to be with you from the beginning to the end. Other things are actually quite flexible and you can change them on the fly and tweak those as your user base evolves and as the way that you use the tool evolves. So we're going to start with workflows and a bit of history on those just for the uninitiated, but where we can really squeeze a lot of performance out of those are in automation, things like tasks. So we'll talk about those in detail. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about groups, users as well, but more specifically groups, how we assign things and really our recommendations on how it's best to control permissions and some of the other offshoots that happen to do with triggering things that have to go to people. So we'll talk about those as well. I also want to talk about a functionality called cold storage. And as your vaults grow and as your company evolves and more people put data in the vault and as hardware starts to get obsoleted, we need to consider what to do with our growing databases, with our growing, in this case, archive server, the data repository. And then we'll talk a little about data cards. Data cards are a great tool for, of course, tracking and visibility when it comes to properties. But really, again, considerations on the goods and the gotchas, the things that you want to look out for when it comes to the way that you utilize these types of tools. And then finally, we'll just get into a couple of nifty things in your Windows Vault view, how to tailor that to each individual's real need when it comes to what needs to be visible easily to them as far as information. So that's going to be our process today. So let's go ahead and jump into all that. Excuse me. Okay, so first let's go ahead and just hop directly into workflows. Workflows really are one of the quintessential features of the tool. And when we get into implementations, this really reveals a lot about a company's structure. And in some cases, the first time for the company from start to finish when we actually start whiteboarding this. Now, the purpose of workflows are to allow us to route data to the right people at the right time. And it also allows us for a very powerful granular control over that visibility. In Windows, you can only really control read, write, or basically invisibility access to folders. But when it comes to workflows, these different states allow us to mask files and reveal them to only people who have permissions to each of those workflow states. So it's incredibly powerful, and it allows you to have multiple people with multiple permissions logged into the same vault structure, but have a very different visual to the way their vaults look based on what their role is and what they should be seeing at the time. Incredibly powerful, and it really prohibits or makes it so that you don't have to do a lot of moving and masking, moving files from one folder to another in order to restrict permissions. In this case, they stay put. Very simple, very elegant, but allows us to control the states of those. Now, we're not going into necessarily instruction on how workflows work. This is going to go a little deeper into things like that. So we have other webinars and information out for those. But what workflows do for you is allow you to tailor things to the way your company works. And we can utilize really automated tools, not just manual types of transitions and states, but ways to go ahead and get things a little bit more automatic or automagic behind the scenes. And each of these workflows, the multiples that you might use, can have a variety of different logic applied to them, just again, depending on the situation. So these icons and the way that they look really is the roadmap to how these files are going to start in these workflows and how they move from one state to another. And again, who has permissions and really some functionality visually that we're seeing based on some of these icons as well. Each of the workflows and multiples can be done, once again, are again in the eye of the beholder of each customer. So these are incredibly powerful and customizable. But we have to think of a few of the issues that we might also run into long term as we're setting these things up. So let's go ahead and just talk a little bit about some of the great parts of these. Some of the powerful tools are the logic, things like parallel transitions. This is more what we call approval by committee, where more than one person has to vote. And once it reaches the threshold of enough yes votes versus no votes, then the file either moves forward or gets rejected. So there's also two different ways out of a state when it comes to these types of parallel transitions. So these are really great because it's not always just a single flow through a lot of these different companies. Automatic transitions allow you to inject files into areas of workflows and then without a user interaction have it transmit or go through that transition to the next state. This is really effective for loading files into your vault the first time and just getting them to a particular state if it's data that's not going to be new but still needs to be put in a particular state into a vault. But it's also great for when tasks automatically create things like PDFs that need to jump into a folder based on an existing released file. So we want them to jump in at the initial state and then them themselves automatically go to released so that they equal the drawing or the Word document or and so on in the equal state. Now with PDM Professional, we have a lot of capabilities here. Unlimited workflows, unlimited workflow states. And with those kinds of things, there are also some responsibilities we want to talk about. While we're using these types of terms and tools, the communication is really a quintessential piece of this. And as you're doing these transitions, whether they're automatic or manual, and when information has to pass from one person to another, we try to use these email notifications as much as possible. And in PDM Professional, you can send this through the task tray, which I typically do with a local installation, or through just a basic email client. When you see a transition that actually has this little bell on there, that indicates that notifications of some kind are being sent during that activity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later with notifications. But this is really just the basis for what a workflow looks like. Now, a transition is a powerful tool. We'll talk some about nomenclature later, but essentially, when you're actually transitioning a file from one state to another, you can capture all of the things that literally a person would do in real life when that activity happens, and just simply make it automatic. Menial tasks, tasks that are simple, but when missed can have bad implications, erroneous data, or just simply incomplete data moving forward. But the basics that we don't want to have to do, the mundane, being able to capture variables about the date that this happened and who actually did it. So these are really important things. And when any file transitions through these types of steps, we can automatically trigger communication. And communication in our case is in the form of notifications. So notifications are a super powerful way of capturing this automatic thing and then having the next person be simply notified without you having to even get up out of your chair to move to discuss that with them. So from a workflow standpoint, that's really the basic great parts of those. Now, there are a lot of things that we try to map up front, and we do these when we do our implementation services, so we reveal these right there. But for anybody that's looking to either expand their PDM implementation or jump into this at some point, we have a few key recommendations that we definitely want to keep at the front of your forethought. So first of all, tools, when you have multiple workflows, can be separated based on just the way that a file or a design is being dealt with in your company. In this case, we're talking about separating workflows for real work versus necessarily prototype or skunkworks types of things. The reason we can do this is because you don't have to put concepts into your real workflow and pollute that particular stage or steps of states, because we have these great things called workflow links. And what those enable us to do is actually take files and jump them from one workflow to another. So at any point from whatever chosen state you have, the file can be transitioned from one to another. And a lot of times we use these when we're trying to capture things like a toolbox part. Now, toolbox parts are SolidWorks parts, but we treat them completely differently than other SLD PRT files, mainly because they're standard components. They shouldn't be revision changed, but due to the mechanisms behind SolidWorks and the way that our configurations are added on demand to those toolbox parts, we need those to actually be able to work through workflows and be edited, but without being transitioned. So a different workflow than your normal CAD workflow is very much a recommendation when it comes to those types of things. But then there are those one-offs. You take a toolbox component, you want to cross-drill it for some sort of application, and then that becomes a component that then needs to come out of that workflow and jump in as a regular component. So we can go ahead and link those pretty simply. Now I'm going to jump in and out a little bit with this by jumping over to the PDM administration tool. And I'm going to do that as many times as I can to give you a little live injection in as well, because I'm not a big fan of death by PowerPoint in these cases. When we're looking at the PDM admin tool, what you'll be presented with is a list like this, whatever your server happens to be, the vaults that you have, and then obviously logging into each of those vaults. Now at the bottom of these is where we house our workflows, and with as many workflows as possible available to you, you can really control different areas of your company in very unique ways. When we're talking about PDM Professional, we're really looking initially at the CAD department, design department. But the reality of this tool is that it can be used anywhere within your company. And that includes any office front, administration, any other types of data, whether it's, PDFs or Word documents or Excel spreadsheets and so on. And those can be treated completely differently. So when you look at something like a CAD workflow in our scenario here, files would start as a design document, be able to move up as a review, and then get released. And then there's an opportunity to take those design files and say, you know what, that's never going to change. Let's just throw that over to the standard parts workflow through this workflow link. And that's where it could jump into a completely different control situation. So again, here, the way to get those parts back out, if there happens to be some one-offs that really started as a standard part, but now need to be some sort of offshoot on their own. So this is a really great way to do this. And when we're trying to go ahead and use these different workflows, it does give us this type of flexibility. So the next part I want to talk about here is avoid PLMing yourself to death. When we get a shiny new toy like workflows, we want to really emphasize what we can do with it. And sometimes we go a little overboard with trying to control things. And when you try to over control it, you end up with workflows that look like this. Now, in some cases, this is absolutely necessary based on the complexity of a company. And I've seen many that do need this type of thing. But many will add additional states or milestones that are simply unnecessary. And really in the situation here, we don't want you to milestone yourself to death. You really should just go ahead, and I'll go back to the previous version of that, but you really should just have the workflow states that are only as complicated as you would need to search for. So if you're looking for files that are in work in progress or being out for manufacturing or in from manufacturing or review or engineering change, those are really the ones you want to capture. Don't go too crazy with this and just make this too much of an eye chart. So very simple there. Let's go ahead and keep that simple. The one thing about these workflow states is that if this is a production vault and if one file has ever entered one of these states, you can't delete it. You could take it out of the flow and move it off to the side, but it will have to sit in that workflow for existence because it is a historical point that one of the files was in at one point. So we don't want to put too much in the beginning. We can always add more as we go, but keep this as simple as it needs to be. But not overly complicated. Definitely a nice happy medium there. Use meaningful nomenclature. You'd be surprised how we start to get into this and there's abbreviations that are being utilized, maybe because of previous life or previous tools that couldn't handle more detail. But Use the meaningful nomenclature that you use as the terminology or the acronyms that you throw around your company typically. You want files that are in a particular state to be natural to the users. So if you use terminology like this is a work in progress, no, I'm waiting for approval, no, that's approved, then that's an absolute positive parallel to your nomenclature. If there are things that you do, like you say you're sending it for concept, or ECR is a terminology you throw out, or WIP means work in progress and everybody knows it. Again, use the nomenclature that is the common slang used around your company. And on top of that, go ahead and take these things and print them. We can print the workflows right out of the admin tool. Put them up on your wall right by your computer. And when you see a file that's in the Windows Vault view simply showing this workflow state, you'll be able to have a visual roadmap of exactly where that file's sitting. You'd be surprised how simple but impactful this is actually to a lot of people, even seasoned PDM users. This reveals a lot to their situation. Loading standard parts. When we're trying to take existing customers, which is most of what we're doing, we're dealing with years worth of SolidWorks data that already exists. And with that year's worth of data, what we want to do is be able to populate the vault properly, but also have an opportunity to scrub the data. In many cases, basic Windows practices and copying of folders, you end up with a lot of duplicates of files that should never have been duplicated in the first place. So when we load up the PDM Vault, we don't want to necessarily pollute the PDM database with the practices of old. So we have a capability to be able to put standard components in, but then we can restrict the duplication of those standard components moving forward so that we can point to the ones that are already in the vault. When we're doing this, you actually get a duplicate file names vetting tool. Pops up, tells you exactly the pathing where all those files actually exist currently when you're trying to put a file into the vault. So let's go ahead and actually move over, and I want to show you that real quickly. So I'm going to move over to just a basic Windows Explorer view. What you see here is my C drive. I have several of these icons here. We call those blueberries. And when you want to get into any vault, it's a simple double click. Now I'm already logged into each of these. But what happens is we get a different view to the vault. We're still in the familiar Windows Explorer environment, so cut, copy, paste, pick and drag, right click to make things like new folders and things. It's all a very natural environment. But then we layer on top of that a Microsoft SQL database and a lot of really great functionality that makes this super powerful. When I'm in any of my folders here, initial setup of any vault is going to pretty much be a little bit more Wild West. You can copy files in as necessary and really take those files and simply do things like copy and paste very easily. So just to be very deliberate for the video's sake here, I'm just going to right click and say copy, and then I'm going to move up just to my, my top level here, maybe all the way up to the top of the vault, and we'll just go ahead and hit paste. Now when you hit paste on something like this, well really, you're just going to be pasting that file in. We now have more than one. But if you copy all of your standard components in and put those nice and safe and sound in a folder that's representative of that, once done, you can go back to your actual admin tool. And by right-clicking on the file names, we have a tool that allows us to deal with duplicate file naming situations. Now in this case, allowing the duplicate file names is the default, so we have the ability to see this pretty much freely. But if you simply say do not allow duplicate file names into the vault, from this point on, it's actually going to throw an error. So if I was to go into, say, a different folder, maybe we'll just go into the CAD folder, go into PDFs just for the sake of being somewhere else. And if I right click here and go ahead and paste, it'll actually yell at me. It says you're trying to put in now a file that has a duplicate name, and then these are the locations that those existing files are already at. And I've done this a couple of times, so I've got a few additional found-ins that are here. And we can take this list and export it. That's going to pop out as an Excel spreadsheet. And then with that spreadsheet, we can go ahead and deal with the situation that's been presented to us because information is the most important part here. Once we know what we're dealing with, we can just go ahead and walk through the work of consolidating these, or maybe even determining that we used the same file name for files that aren't even identical. So that's something that's a decision that has to be made with this information in hand. So simply add all your standards in, and as you start to copy in folders full of assemblies, you'll be able to find out whether those folders now contain a lot of the copies of those standards within them as well. And as that happens, we can repoint the references to the standard folders and then make sure that everything is referencing the single standard component, not multiple copies of the same file. Lastly, in workflows, I want to go ahead and just mention that PDFs are what I would consider a bit of an anomaly. The way that work happens these days, PDFs very much are for end stream users. I just call them a customer, but that customer could be somebody in the building, that's the manufacturing's individuals or sales or anybody really. But what we need to really decide up front here is whether those PDFs for their purposes, produced from any of your CAD documents or Office documents, whether they need to live inside the vault or not. Now, the mechanism with SolidWorks here is that we use tasks for this, but we need to know who needs to access the PDFs. And most importantly, do they have a login to PDM? Because if they live inside the vault with the PDFs and people can't log in, then of course there's a wall between them. Now, in a network environment, in most cases, multi-user environment, we have a lot of licenses available, and it's only about the amount of people that are logged into the vault simultaneously. So with viewer licenses, we try to foster access to the vault because it's the secure location, and that way you can take PDFs both in and out of circulation when they update. But if we're trying to mitigate license purchase just for the sake of cost mitigation, then having those files thrown outside the vault is definitely an acceptable practice. With a task, and the way we do save PDFs, it actually is an automatic choice here. Typically, we'll take our default path and we'll throw that somewhere adjacent to the original file. So if it's a 2D SolidWorks drawing, we'll put it in the same folder, or a folder that is just consistent throughout the way that we treat data. But if it's a file that has to be accessible to somebody without a login, we have a secondary location which can be thrown somewhere, anywhere within the network, any network drive. And typically, if it's manufacturing floor people, there's a place that they're already pathing to and manually browsing to find the data that they need. So by getting control of data in the front office, we don't necessarily have to disrupt the entire company and change their practices as well. But consider this. Consider whether that data should be within the secure location and just providing somebody the proper login so you can control what they see, or throwing it outside the vault, which then makes it uncontrolled. Really no way to make sure that that file is rescinded when it's updated or overwritten with a new version when it's updated. So those are the considerations, both good and bad, when it comes to how this PDF tool and saving those files outside is going to impact you. So just for the workflows part of this, I wanted to recap because that was a lot of information very quickly. But we want to consider using separate workflows for files that are real versus maybe not quite real yet or just concept. Avoid too many states. You just really want to find states that are milestones that are real and important to you. Don't add too much in the beginning. They're very difficult to remove. If a file has ever been in those states, you put them off to the side. It doesn't really impact the functionality, but they do have to sit in those workflows, though not connected by transitions, in perpetuity. So that's going to be forever there. Use meaningful nomenclature. Again, simple, but we can't overstate this because just simply using the slang that everybody knows makes this a much more natural implementation when it comes to having things in workflows. And if you're sitting there, I'm a visual person, and I may have memory of what a workflow is, but by just simply seeing those little blocks up on your wall and seeing the state that files are in, you sort of get a picture of where files are sitting when parts of an assembly or a design have moved forward while parts are still waiting for something, and then how we can sync those guys up and move them forward. Those visual roadmaps are very impactful, and engineers by nature are pretty visual, so works out nice. Loading the standard components in the vault. Clean things up, get them in there, and then load up all the folders with the actual designs, and then it'll reveal a lot of those accidental copies that you've done just through the purposes of using Windows the way Windows works. And last again was the PDF workflows. Inside or outside the vault, it's all about licenses here. I prefer them inside, but that's a cost. So we want to keep things as simple and streamlined as possible, keep them moving forward, throw them out where those individuals that utilize those PDFs always utilize them, and you can just decide later if you need to get them into PDM. Okay, so let's move on to tasks. I really talk this more about repetitive tasks because a task is something that isn't necessarily difficult, but it's something that happens every single time. And we can make sure with PDM Professional that that does happen every single time. Now, what tasks really amount to are things like convert tasks. That's essentially these types of file save ases that happen directly out of SolidWorks. These will happen during a workflow transition. So as a file is approved, for example, a whole bunch of files can be generated and then thrown out into the prescribed folders, and then notifications sent to all the people individually that need to know about that new data being available. Incredibly powerful tool. Creating PDFs has gotten more mature over the last few releases. SolidWorks 2D drawings generally we throw out as PDFs. Some companies will do 3D PDFs as well, which we're doing with our model-based definition quite often. But DraftSite, which is a 2D product from Dassault Systems, as well as Microsoft Office files can also be saved using these tools as direct to PDF. So using the raw data automatically creates a PDF and again puts it in a prescribed folder notifying individuals that the data is now there. Great way to mask those files, and then PDFs being the non-editable versions. That's really the purpose of taking your data and securing it essentially before you throw it over the wall. And then print tasks. If your process is to release files, and then your next step is to then take all these drawings, open them up, and make the prints, we can capture that as well. We can designate the printers, the type of paper size it's going to use, a whole bunch of notifications whether it happens properly or not. And then essentially by doing your job, it will automatically trigger these printers to start functioning, and you should just be able to walk over there and grab your paper off the end of the bin. So tasks are great, but again, they happen at a milestone. They happen at a transition. So where we were with workflow transitions a little while ago talking about notifications, this time I'm talking about a bunch of the stuff that I've thrown at the bottom of this list. As soon as I right click and say approved, what it automatically does is sets a bunch of variables and sets a bunch of properties. But then at the bottom, it fires off a whole bunch of save as operations. So for this purpose, we created JPEGs, step files, PDFs, DXFs, and then a bunch of PDF files out of Office. And we gave those to necessary departments. So the people in the sales group got a bunch of different files. People in manufacturing got a little bit different set of files based on what they need. And then even marketing was involved with a bunch of sales imagery, all by simply right-clicking and saying approved. So again, map out the things that you do in your company, especially the tasks that are not necessarily difficult, but have to happen all the time like clockwork. Put those in our workflow stages, and as those transitions are fired, like clockwork, once again, you're going to have that type of process taken care of. So we'll talk a little bit more about those coming back here in just a second, but we wanted to move into groups on this because when you're setting up data management, really the whole thing is all about permissions. It's all about how you set somebody's visibility up so that they can see what they're supposed to see. Now, when I'm talking groups, really I'm talking users because users are individual data. It's the email address and phone number for a person, maybe their image, a little bit about maybe their address, but users really are the lightest part of this. When I apply permissions, I apply 99% of those permissions at the group level. And the reason is because it's a lot easier to manage at that higher level. Dealing with 100 people and having to set 100 sets of individual checkboxes when it comes to permissions, you're going to miss something. Somebody is going to have something different than other people. Yet when it comes to groups, it's very easy to throw a person into multiple groups and then simply have them have a hybrid of the capabilities that those groups allow. So let me bounce out once again to our admin tool a second here just to show you a little bit about this. Whenever I'm looking at groups again, users are what we're talking about, but really I'm throwing those users into groups. So with this particular vault here, we've got a bunch of different groups here, and I got a couple here just for demonstration's sake, but we typically take the departments that you have. So administration, people with higher powers, drafters or engineers, depending on their roles once again, and then people who are really just consuming data but not creating data. And these are some pretty typical things. Nomenclature here could also match exactly what you call people within your company. When it comes to the users though, let me just go ahead and add a brand new user. A little right click on this one and we'll say new user, and very deliberately just add it. Not really thinking too much here, so we'll just use PDM user. Now when I add this user, what you're going to have is a bunch of information to add whoever they happen to be, and again maybe some imagery when it comes to exactly what this person's face might look like when somebody hovers over their name over files that they have ownership of. But what we talk about here are permissions. Permissions. There's whole different sets of these, and they're a bit of an eye chart. When you look at administration permissions, this is what somebody can do inside the vault, whether it happens to be setup or editing or administration of any kind. Folder permissions are really the rights. This is what Windows does very poorly, and we do very powerfully because of the granular capabilities of being able to allow somebody to add data, but not necessarily delete or destroy as individual options, or maybe be able to create but not move things, even inadvertently not be able to move a folder. So permissions like this are fantastic. But again, if you have to administer this 4 dozen checkboxes that I just showed you in 2 lists for each individual person, there's going to be inconsistencies. So what I prefer to just simply go ahead and add them to groups. So I have no checkboxes listed right now, but if I simply go up to groups and we add our PDM new user to a group that exists, let's just call this the top half permissions. This is a group that I have set that has capabilities to do the top half of things in the administrative and folder permissions. So when you go back, what you're going to see here is that there are still no individual check marks, but by the virtue of being in a group, this person has these permissions. Same with folder permissions. Go ahead and select the top level folder, and each granular folder beneath that can have individual permissions. And based on the group that they're in, you're going to see the icons there, including a few that I've skipped here because I don't like people to have destroy. You're going to see that those permissions simply hybrid. And again, as I drop this person into another group, let's just add that bottom half permissions as well, just to prove the point. By being part of two different groups, whatever the conglomeration of those two groups' permissions are going to give this person the cumulative total of the different options that those groups have. And then if I really needed to, well, I could come in here and I could manually append this person to add these superhuman powers of destroy and rollback. So you've got some great capabilities, but the group is definitely where we want to go ahead and add this type of permission. Just go ahead and add that person. When we send notifications, I also recommend sending those to the group, and mainly because, especially in a larger company, you might not be aware of who happens to be in the building at the time. And if you send files forward to pending approval, they might sit there until the one person that you think is supposed to be looking at those would look at those. But by sending it to a group, multiple people will be notified, and then when somebody does approve those, then those can move forward. Now that is on top of an additional check mark here called dynamic. Dynamic actually allows for this little pick box or pick list in the lower right-hand corner. This could be prescribed to go to a group hard and fast, but by checking it dynamic, that's also going to enable the ability for you to granularly check somebody's name. So if I know that Jeff is here today, I might check his name, knowing for sure that that notification is going to him, maybe not being sure necessarily that it's going to him based on automated group notification settings. Now, anytime we're dealing with these are once again at the workflow state. So when we're taking a look at anything inside a workflow, you might have a situation here where let's get into a little bit of a different workflow here just for the sake of example. When we're looking at this type of a workflow here, and I have a file that's moving through this approved state, whenever this type of thing is happening, we want to go ahead and be able to deal with notifications. Now, the notifications here can be added by simply saying add a notification. And like I said, this can be granular to the top level of the entire vault, or individual down to a folder inside of a subfolder. If you only want the activity that happens in this subfolder to then be subject to whatever this notification happens to be. At any situation, though, that we have here, we have the capability of making sure that these recipients are either users or groups. And I can either go into the individual groups and grab a user, or I should just grab the group itself. The key to all of this, though, is that if you take that group and turn it into dynamic, that's where that pick box comes in. So now what I'm going to have is an automatic notification sent to this group, but also the ability for the user that's sending it to proactively check somebody's name, knowing that they're going to get that, where maybe they don't have the information underneath that that person would already be getting that notification. It's just a great visibility way to be able to make sure the data is moving through the process as it needs to. Now, two things that are very powerful when it comes to this are conditional notifications and delayed in state notifications. Conditional is relatively new. It's only within the last couple of releases of SolidWorks. And that actually allows us to make notifications variable based on things like the value that's in a data card cell. So if somebody put in a value of prototype versus refurb versus new design into a field, that particular property might then trigger the notifications to go to the prototype group or the refurb group or the new design group. So it's an incredible way to have a single type of a notification be variable, again, simply based on the situation at hand with the data in the file. No real knowledge of the user transitioning those would be necessary. Delayed in state, though, this is the one where when people are out of the building for a variety of reasons, might be on vacation and you just don't know, that if the file stays there for long enough, we can have an activity take place. Now, this is what the box actually looks like. But again, I'm going to dive back into the admin tool here to show you exactly where this is. So once we're back in the admin tool, anytime we're sitting through these transitions, I mentioned that the little bell indicates that there's a notification taking place. So as a file moves through, we can have notifications sent that that file went from pending approval to approved. So that's simply the fact that took place right there. Now again, with conditional notifications, there might be several different outs where you might have some sort of condition that's then going to control exactly what triggers it to go say left versus right in this case. And it could be something that's a category or some sort of information in the file name, but it also could be just based on a property, again, a description or some sort of hard and fast property that it dictates to you which department within the company it's supposed to go. So those are fantastic right there for conditional notifications. Those are set on transitions under the notification tab. Now, when a file is sitting, say in pending approval, designer creates it, right clicks, submits pending approval or submit for approval, and then it sits in pending approval. We don't want the file to languish here and not move forward. So whether everybody in a group that would have been notified wasn't there, or it just simply hasn't gotten picked up by anybody because they're too busy, we can go to this notifications tab, and this is where we can really get into some more of the additional the details that come into each of these situations. So the one that we're looking at right now, if I go ahead and add a folder notification to something like this, now what we're talking about is a notification based on something. Now, whether it's a checked in notification I could be informed of or checked out, but delayed in state is the key here. And that means that if a file was transitioned into this, we can have a wiggle room here that says, okay, I'm willing to wait a day for this to be dealt with. But after that, I need this to be taken care of. So let's just go ahead and say that every day after that, it's going to keep triggering this notification to the people into their inbox. So it won't allow that file to just sit there and pile up and other files pile up behind it. It's going to have a trigger that's going to automatically trigger itself as that file sits there for that 24-hour period. So this is, again, settable based on days, 1 day, 2 days, whatever that happens to be. But that will allow that to just be some sort of I fired it and I forgot it, but it doesn't mean it's always forgotten. It's going to have a little bit of life there once it reaches this threshold. So those are set at the state, where the notifications are typically, conditional notifications are set at the transition. This one's also interesting. It's called Ignore Permissions from Previous Group Flag. Now back over into the workflow states once again, it's a little flag that shows up on each of those workflow states. And the tricky part here is that permissions are a big deal. And permissions can be residual in some cases to where when a file was in a particular state, that can have an effect on how somebody has access to it in the future. So if we want files that are pending approval, for example, that wouldn't have anybody be able to take ownership of, that could prevent something from some other state in the future from that file being taken ownership of, if that's a permission that stops that from an individual. So by going into any one of these states, once again, either a double click or a right click properties, the check mark here is the ignore permissions in previous state. What that essentially does is it takes this state and it treats it as more of an isolated situation, a bit of an island. So what happened before it historically really doesn't matter. It's how this permissions are set for a user at this particular state. This is typically a little easier to deal with when it comes to an audit trail when you're trying to figure out why people can't do particular things. And there's a lot of other states and transitions and permissions at each of those that, if not all set properly, won't set the proper stage for somebody necessarily getting the approval control or whatever they're trying to reach. But by triggering that ignore previous, again, it really isolates it down to just this one situation. Can this person do this with a file set to the approved state? This can be set after the fact. I can check it on and off and reduce or restrict permissions really on the fly. Once you make a change like this, just by hitting the save button, you have now deployed any changes that we have made to either this state or going into the transitions or into the states and setting the notifications or the delayed in state notifications. So all of the things that I'm doing here in workflow can happen on a live access data vault. And once you go ahead and hit the save button, you've deployed those changes out to your users. So very cool stuff here. Okay, let's talk a bit about cold storage. Now, cold storage has an intent, and the intent is essentially to take data, many times old versions of files, and move those off to a different storage location. Hard drive spaces being the commodities that they are, users get to a habit or a thought that if you have a file that gets a lot of versions, say 28 versions in a file, you only want to keep the last handful plus all revisions, released files. And then other than that, let's get the other stuff out of here. Now, though that sounds great in concept, and in reality, it does remove the data from the archive server, which is the repository, you're throwing that to a different location on a hard drive. So there is a downside to this. The downside is that there still is a database bloat. There are pointers that have to manage this data in SQL. It's on a different drive, so you're moving things around. So there are some downsides to this. when you have an unlimited vault size or database size, it may or may not be an issue for you. But again, considerations that it isn't just a clearing of that data out and then you're just free and clear with lighter everything. SQL does not change. It simply does move that from one repository drive to another. Now, when you're in the cold storage location, delete there is a destroy. You have a delete operation inside of the PDM vault view, but there's a secondary operation to physically clear the recycle bin to do the destroy. When you're working in any cold storage, any type of delete, there's no recovery from that. So be aware of that. Once again, important thing to know there. Really, mostly we recommend doing this on a job-by-job basis. There are automated tools set up that can do this, and I'm going to move into that really quickly right now just to show you where that is. Wherever you happen to be within your Vault admin tool, you'll see right about in the middle here, we've got cold storage schemas. Now with that, you can just simply create a new one by right-clicking. Now it's pretty self-explanatory. You're using whatever server your files are located on. You have a choice of either deleting the files, which will clear them out altogether, or moving them to a different location, which you can simply browse to. Up here. The way that it archives will make them somewhat cryptic. So you can choose some naming conventions here, whether you want to just go ahead and save those out as something like, say, maybe a day dash year dash day dash whatever month, something like that, depending on your nomenclature. And then where you want those to go would just be simply by adding different folder locations. There are times, like scheduling a defrag type of tool, set it and forget it here. Does it happen every hour on the hour? Does it happen once a week? Again, those are the typical choices. And usually in this case, what versions do you keep in your original file archive? Well, I usually like to keep some within the last few days or a month or so, but maybe that's 5 versions to you. Anything that is a revision, never move. I say revisions are released. Those are actual real goods. So regardless of how many versions of a file you have, those are a different milestone that I like to keep. So never move versions with revisions to the cold storage. And in this case, you can just simply say OK. And on those intervals, it will go ahead and start to take the files. And in this case, move those data files to the archive. So that's the functionality of the tool. Now with this, I've got some different recommendations here. Technology these days, it's getting a little bit easier to hot swap data. So putting a drive into an existing archive server in many cases is actually quite easy to do. These cases span across that drive. Virtual machines allow for hard drive allocation with just a bunch of sliders. You can add more drives to those machines, and really, again, just by editing the virtual machine and adding more hard drive space to it, you have on the fly increased its storage space. But there's also the use of network accessible storage. And this also is getting better. Network accessible storage originated before really solid state drives existed. And now we're getting into a situation where the higher spinning rates or solid state drives are very stable, very large, and less expensive. So the latency isn't as big a deal, but it typically is a drive that's attached through things like network cables or routers and hubs. So we want to go ahead and make sure that you understand that copying data in and out of those will have to deal with the speed of the input and the output of that drive. So latency could be there. Of course, the more money you throw at that, the faster the I/O is going to be on a device like those. What you could also consider, though, is this, something called relocate. Now, relocate is a feature inside of your PDM archive server administration tool. Now, for this, what I'm going to do is actually go down to my Windows button and hit search. To actually do the operation I'm going to show you here, all I do is just start typing archive in the search tool, and you'll see that it comes up with the archive server configuration. Of course, you have to have PDM loaded. Once you open up this tool, it's a simple process of going into the vaults that you have available. And then if I have a vault that I need to put some more space onto, I can just right click on that and say relocate. Now with this, what you're seeing here is a very simple interface. 100% of my data is located on my F drive in this PDM data folder. Now if I have a different drive that I've just added to the computer, we can simply add that another location, that additional location. We path to it. Let me just throw that in my programs drive so it's a different place. And then I'm just going to add it to a folder I called space. Just a place to put it. Once I put that space folder out there, using my slider, I can add room to that drive. Now my total currently is 150, and if I say okay to this, it's going to yell at me and say, you got to make it 100%. So what you'll need to do there is then take your additional drive, say maybe I only want 50% of the data over there and 50% of the data on this drive. And then what we'll now have is 2 different locations now completely housing your PDM repository, your archive server in this case. So that tool works pretty effectively as well, and it's going to go ahead and make sure that everything works with that vault spanning those multiple hard drive locations. All right, let's move down into data cards for a moment. A couple more topics here and then we'll wrap up. Data cards are a great way to get some consistency. Now, the data card purpose is to really display to you the properties that are important. And really, like states and workflows, we don't want you to overdo this. The properties that are important, we absolutely want you to include right there, especially on the first page. But if there's other properties or variables that you don't need, you can bury those under other tabs here. Things like the comment or different sign-offs down in this example that we have here. So really, you only need to make these as complicated as you need to see. Now with these, we can really automatically populate these a couple of different ways. Variables, which are the data properties that we use or custom properties from SolidWorks files, they will automatically be populated if you if you copy in and check in data from SolidWorks that has properties that match fields like the description, revision, checked by, date, cost, those types of things, material properties and such. In fact, a few of the ones that you see on my example card here are grayed out because those are read-only values. Those are only populated from the CAD data. But other ways that we can eliminate typing on the keyboard are things like lists. Lists really enable us to not have things mean the same but be typed different, therefore they will be searched for different. So if it comes to somebody using abbreviations versus full words, we can gather this by just being a pull-down list and make sure that nobody types in something with a company name with .co or .LLC, and they think they're doing the same thing, but then they end up being two different properties in essence. So those are the things that we really want to do when it comes to these types of cells. Now, not all variables need to be saved to SolidWorks. When you're setting up the properties in PDM, as long as you're not setting a custom property and then forcing that data point back into the SolidWorks file, it doesn't need to live in the SolidWorks properties. So in this case, really only save the ones back to SolidWorks that you need, because that again will have an effect on the SolidWorks file size. Now these cards are file and folder specific, so the types of files that you use, the extensions essentially allow you to deem what card is used for what proper file type. So we want you to give a good consideration up front for this. A lot of times what I'm thinking in these cases is, do you want a separate data card for a SolidWorks part versus assembly versus a drawing? Or do all three of those file types exist on the same card? Now, in some cases there are data points that are different, like an assembly wouldn't have a material property where a part would. But it's a difference between consistency of what your people are seeing versus what data is really important to your company. So we would just have a blank material for an assembly and a drawing, and maybe a filled out material cell for a part file. But when you're dealing with these, there's other things that we have to consider as well. You got to watch out when you're setting them up. Unfortunately, there's a little discontinuity here and there within the user interface, and it has to do with how you include the file extensions in a couple of different locations. The data cards, when you're setting those up, you have to actually separate the extensions with semicolons versus the actual properties, the variables, you separate those with commas. So they're very clear as to what they say here. Really don't say a whole lot of it here. But I want to bounce again back into the admin tool because this is a pretty important thing. When I'm looking at a variable, let's say we're talking about description. First of all, the fact that this is set to custom property is what forces this description back into the SolidWorks files, and we even deem the extensions that are there. But down here at the bottom, once again, it says separate these with a comma. So you can type those in manually, you can add additional ones. Maybe I want to go ahead and also add in SLD LFP, maybe a library feature part. So that would be a property that would then go back into that type of file as well. And when you look at that, it's going to automatically apply to just those types of documents. However, when we get up into the data card area, data cards are where things can get a little bit dicier. When you're looking at the actual file cards, what you'll see right here is that my CAD card, the one that you're going to see pop up right now, is going to be applied to AutoCAD drawings, DXF, DWG, and then 3 SolidWorks file types. However, Excel files are going to go to a completely different data card. It's customized, it looks different, and just contains different data based on the animal that it is. When you're setting these different things up, though, over here, you actually have to separate those out into semicolons. Now, what's the discontinuity here and the gotcha that I want you to be aware of, it's not earth-shattering, but knowing it is important, is over here is where you're going to actually separate those with a semicolon. What happens is that even though we've separated them with a semicolon, still visually in your Vault setup, you're going to see that they're separated with a comma. So just be aware of that. Keep it the same way so that it includes properly. But the way we display that out here, again, is a little bit of discontinuity. So I want you to be completely aware of that. Now, regardless of what's happening there, what I really like to foster out of this is the use of things like lists. I use this in my demonstration vaults quite often because lists are important because it doesn't necessarily mean it's a static list. It could be a list of things that come from another source like a front office database tool. And it enables us to have a data card here where I don't have to type somebody's name, for example. These are names of people who have logins in PDM Professional. And then down here, I have a list of vendors, which is actually driven by our front office system in a momentary and once a week handshake with an XML file. So the front office system will kick off the new customer list, throw it into a folder that PDM Professional is monitoring, and then PDM Professional will bring in that XML file and modify this list. So those are some things that really gain, again, it eliminates the person from typing on the keyboard and creating different data inadvertently because they think they're doing the right thing. It's the greatest way to get that type of consistency and ease of use there. Watch out for those. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, so enough with each of these things. Let's go ahead and finish up the last little feature here, which is columns. Columns in many cases I feel is a little bit of an unsung hero when it comes to data acquisition. When you're looking at your Vault view, you're looking at Windows Explorer, and not only do we have control over a lot of the permissions when it comes to files and their states and what's visible, but we also have complete control over all of the columns that any individual or group sees within the actual Vault view. Now, just like permissions, I control these with the group level. So everything that I like to do here is going to be applied to the total group, but you do have individual user capabilities as well. So this is what this one actually looks like. I first want to just go over into my Windows Vault view for a moment. Now in my little DASI demo vault here that I was just showing you a moment ago, what I want you to focus on with my CAD data here is across the top, we have things like name, state, checked out by. And these are some pretty typical things. You can take these columns and you can move them around and resequence them any way that is important to you. Now when you go into your administration tool, go into my Darren's demo vault or DASI vault, what we have are settings for those columns. So in this case, we've got a few different things added. We have a nifty column that I really like here called the version number. And then we also have this one here called SolidWorks last saved with. Now I'm going to add a new column to this. When you click new column, you can choose the default width of that, although these are resizable. But you can also go ahead and hit the pull down list here to show exactly what these happen to be. So maybe I like the description. That's a big deal for me. And then I'm going to go ahead and add one more new column, which is a great one here called ID. Now ID is a little bit mystical because what it really is it matches up the file with the actual ID in the raw Vault view, which is essentially the data repository. Not something that most people are going to see, but from an IT standpoint, it's a great way when we're trying to bug or error check things to be able to link up the file with the situation at hand. With this, what I can do is either go ahead and apply it to the entire groups, or I can just make sure that individual users have those permissions, and not everybody needs to have that. By adding it to the user that I'm logged into currently, what we'll see here is as I go back to my Vault view, I have state and I have name here, but I really just have these raw data file states. By simply cycling in and out of this folder, maybe going up one folder, you actually see the new columns have been added, and then I go back into the folder, you see once again that live transition took place when I edited the Vault and saved my settings. Now the user interaction changes immediately. So we can now see the version number of a file. I like to see the last saved version. Surprising, I get back to SolidWorks 2001 files in a lot of cases here. And then the description, which to me is the very way to be verbose about what a file is while still having very cryptic file names. So each one of these things, again, can be controlled, where maybe I don't want everybody to know the version number, or maybe I'm a higher end user and I need to know a few more back office things like cost and material acquisition and vendor and things like that. But in any event, you have full control over those types of settings. You can make new ones, put totally different things here. Maybe this person needs to be able to see the description only. And then we can go ahead and say that my friendly PDM user that we just added is a person that's going to see this new one with just the DESC in it. So that's a way to be able to filter those out. Again, everybody's view should be what they need to see, and it's pretty easy to set each of those up. So there's a lot of things that we can do with each of these. Again, my favorite ones happen to be that version number that was added recently, the SolidWorks last saved version, and then the ID. Version number here is great because that gives you the same symbology that you see next to your files when you're looking at the tab inside of your SolidWorks PDM tab. So you'll see the same green, red arrows, the slash that would be the files not in the Vault yet, and then your equals, which is the latest and greatest. So those are some really good tools for those. Okay, so we're coming up on our time on this one right now. So what I wanted to do is just follow up at the end of this a little bit here and just again cover what we covered there again, which was a bit about workflows, how to automate those with tasks, and the things that you really need to think about when you're planning these workflows. Don't go overboard, but use the power. Again, there's a very happy medium there, and you can settle on it. Doesn't necessarily have to be up front, but some good forethought is going to make this a more smooth process. Use groups more than anything. A person that's a member of multiple groups will have the conglomeration or the basically the common or the total of all of their different possibilities or capabilities. But when you want to restrict somebody, you can just pull them out of the group very quickly instead of trying to figure out which magic special sauce of combination check marks they need to do their job individually or properly. Cold storage, it sounds like a great concept, but I think these days with the way that the hard drives and technology with virtual machines are set up, we can do better with that by maybe using some more additional virtual machine capabilities or just simply adding data onto a different storage location using relocate. Set up your data cards nicely. These are fluid. They can change pretty much as you'd like. It is something that I think evolves more than anything because of what we think we want in the front end of an implementation versus what really works for you. So that one's really more of just considerations of what it can do and how to get more out of it. But it is more flexible and fluid throughout the life cycle of a PDM implementation than other things. And then columns, that really to me is gravy. That's great access to the data that you need without diving into data cards and properties and digging deeper to find the information that you might need. So thank you very much for spending an hour with us today. I really hope it was worth your time. We're going to put this up again on our YouTube channel, so that'll be available to us shortly. I'm going to do a quick check over here and just see if any questions were added. And then after that, we're just going to go ahead and finish the session out. Okay, so a couple things that we've got here. Can you rename a workflow state after it's created? You can, as long as a file hasn't already gone through that state. And what I basically mean by that is if a workflow state has been placed there, there is a historical marker in a file that's gone through that transition. So for one reason or another, you can't delete the state at all. So a lot of times it's a swap out or a swap in of that particular workflow state, or creating another state that's got the name and then trying to swap those names out. But that can be a little tricky with that. So there's where your nomenclature definitely, you want to make sure that you test that through before it goes full production on the vault. Duplicate file names. Can you overwrite the file over itself, keeping the existing version, or do you have to choose which part you keep? So when you have files that are checked in, as long as you have them checked out, which typically when we're dealing with setting up a vault in the beginning, you want to be the admin, which is the super user permissions. You can pretty much do anything that you need to get the vault set. When you have a file that's in the vault and you try to copy another file of the same name in it, permissions would allow you to overwrite previous version. That's something that, again, is something I wouldn't set for everybody, but more for a higher end user. That would essentially eliminate any previous versions of what that file looked like. But a lot of times when you copy over top of an existing file and check in, you're ending up with a new version. So it's based on whether you have the ability to overwrite previous version or not in those cases. Really vetting the files and making sure which is the final version of that is probably the best way to go, but that could also be something that evolves as you find new data in these folders that may or may not have been changed as well. That looks like we got all those covered. So again, I appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you very much for spending the day with us or the hour with us. If there's any topics that you're interested in, deeper dives, anything really specific, please let us know. And we're happy to go ahead and get as much information out there to the public as possible so that you can make these proper choices as you move forward with SolidWorks. So once again, thank you very much. I'm Darren and appreciate your time today. Have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.